First of all, my name is Shane Coughlin, and I'm the General Manager of the OpenChain project. The OpenChain project is about building trust in the supply chain, and we have spent quite a few years doing that. Our initial focus was on how trust can be built utilizing effective license compliance processes. Over time, of course, we've investigated and contributed to other areas of trust in the supply chain, such as security, of course, as well as mergers and acquisitions, export control, and other topics that are front of mind for companies delivering products all over the world. Now, OpenChain, well, it's a big project. We have regional work groups on 3 continents. We have global work groups covering everything from managing our ISO standard for license compliance through to developing new standards like the one that we're just finishing for security. This year, we're holding a series of summits trying to capture important points about what's happening and why. We had a security summit in February where we previewed our work and the work of others to make sure that open source security and more generally technology security was working better. Now we're going to talk about IP, because when it comes to using software, especially collaborative software, nothing is more important than getting third-party intellectual property right. This IP Summit is taking place with the same basic structure of other OpenChain meetings. We have our antitrust reminder set up first. This shows you where to find the full Linux Foundation antitrust policy on our website. And of course, if you have any questions, you can raise them. This is an example of how we communicate openly as a community without causing any issues regarding products to market and solutions and fairness to all. Our agenda today is structured, I think, in a way that will be useful. We're going to have an overview of copyright and open source in 2022. That will happen by myself, given that my primary activities and the primary activities of OpenChain is making sure copyright and open source works well. We're going to be welcoming Keith Burgelt, the CEO of OpenVention Network, to talk about patents this year. Patents, obviously, are business critical all over the globe. And having a good idea of the general field is going to be very important when it comes to making the right decisions. But after these 2 higher level overviews, we're going to dip down a little further into practical stuff. When it comes to analyzing what you've got and why you've got it, tools and approaches have been getting better and better. Now, you're probably very familiar with some of the key tools used for scanning software, some of the key tools used for logging it. But I wanted to give us a little preview of what's really at the cutting edge for finding out what stuff is. And that's designed to give us a taste of going from the big strategic view into actual implementation of getting stuff done. Now, this is a webinar structure, which means that relatively few people will be talking, but you will notice that there is a Q&A available, and you can ask questions there. I highly recommend that you take the time to use the Q&A where possible throughout the talks to raise questions on any points that you might think are useful, interesting, or enlightening. Remember, there's no such thing as a bad question. We also have the ability for people to do everything else, like chatting. We have a chat window as well. You can use that instead of the Q&A if you so wish, though I prefer the Q&A where possible. Beyond that, I'm afraid things are locked down a bit. The reason is that we have found, as we increasingly work in the security domain, we've had some issues with people trying to troll some of our events. And this means that the summits have moved from an open kind of collaborative room format into this more structured format. Forgive me for the slight restriction, but I think we can still get everything we need done. Right, I'm keeping my eye on the Q&A and I'm keeping my eye on the chat. So if you've got anything, put it there. And I will begin our first section on copyright. So I think this year in particular is one of the more interesting years for copyright and open source. The reason is that in the last 12 months or so, China, Japan, and Korea have released policy or position statements about open source. And these have been pretty broad things. We're going to have a look at them in a minute. But in essence, the governments of these extremely important nations have clearly put open source into their sights and actually done something about guiding their local markets around it. The European Union has an open source office at the Commission, which is a step forward. For many years, the Commission engaged with open source, but the open source office is relatively new, and it indicates a new stage for policymaking on one of the largest economic blocs in the world. And of course, the United States has done some very important things at the presidential level about open source from the optic of security, but it shows how important open source is and to what extent it's at the center of the dialogue. Now, a lot of you are dialing in, I see, from India and Europe, as well as, of course, our friends in the United States and our friends in China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. For your illumination, I'm going to dig a little bit into what we've seen from some countries out there. We're going to have a look at China, we're going to have a look at Japan, and of course, we'll touch on the United States for those parties in Europe and North America. The document I'm most interested from in China relates to the Cyberspace Administration giving instructions to the financial sector of China. The instructions are clear and unambiguous. They instruct the financial sector to utilize open source technology, to respect open source licensing, and to engage with the global community. Now, naturally, the financial sector in China is one of the key sectors, and this shows an advanced position of the Chinese government that has reverberated across other markets as well. It's clear that for the Chinese government, open source is a strategic pillar of what's happening. It's also clear that for the Chinese government, open source is normalized in the use of critical domains. So, in a nutshell, the banks can use it. They expect the banks to get things like licensing right, and they expect the banks to collaborate with the global community. In Japan, we saw some guidance from the Ministry of Trade. Now, the Ministry of Trade's guidance is a different flavor. It's more of instructive guidance, showing how things like open source management work, how to use something like OpenChain, how to use something like SPDX. It's a guidance which allows companies to know precisely what is expected of them by the regional authority on trade and industry. It is notable that this guidance essentially is positioned to demystify the concepts of open source. It's not providing for the idea that open source is new, exciting, or unknown. It's saying use the ISO standards to manage this stuff. This particular guidance was soon followed by guidance from the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, basically saying the same thing. Interesting stance, similar to China, normalization of open source at the front level of national software usage. And of course, then we have the US executive order on cybersecurity, which talks about software bill of materials, and it ended up putting things like SPDX really front of mind. Now, the US optic was focused on cybersecurity, where China and Japan are focused on essentially trade. But the intersection is obvious. The Chinese government, the Japanese government, and the American government want people to be able to manage open source effectively and manage software effectively, to identify what it is, to know how they can use it, and to be pretty certain that they got that right. Now, I think that's important. All of these things have come together. We mustn't get distracted by a single one. I mean, the US activity is superb, it's very useful, but it's by far from being the only one out there. And of course, everyone has a slightly different spin on how they're describing this stuff. But taken as an aggregate, it's an interesting indicator for the open source copyright domain. We're seeing something that, well, quite frankly, we've identified over a decade ago, which is the normalization of open source in copyright. While it was once seen as something special, it's now being seen as business as usual by some of the slowest moving entities in the domain of trade, the governments themselves. And of course, that is a heartening development. It's a development that we called as a potential future, a useful future for open source. But it does have some ramifications we're going to unpack. So, the first thing I'd say is that moving away from the discussions around how open source matured, et cetera, I think what we're seeing is that software composition analysis and software bill of materials are the go-to mental models for addressing software. Software composition analysis has long been part of the traditional side or the proprietary side of software, and more recently it's entered into the domain of open source as an active conversation. Meanwhile, SBOMs have been part of the open source conversation for ages, and they're more and more involved in other aspects of the software supply chain. SCA and SBOM are integrated now in pretty much everything we do. And if someone in a company is not using SCA approaches and SBOMs today, it's more than likely that they're aware that they have to prepare for it tomorrow. There's a lot of great material about these topics, and I wanted to highlight one good example of SCA. This is from the Sync blog. It's about the software development lifecycle, and they're talking about how SCA should be running through the entire cycle, from making your software through to deploying it through to maintaining it. And that concept of SCA analysis being a continuous long-term sustainability issue um, has, I think, penetrated all aspects of the software industry at this juncture. We've also seen some really good overviews of SBOM. Here's one from the NTIA website. It's less flashy than the commercial vendors one, but it's also very useful. In essence, until recently, our approach to software bill of materials was ad hoc. We would pass material from company to company with perhaps in a purchasing silo, a singular approach. The idea of having cross-market approaches to SBOM, relatively new. But the implications for upstream and downstream are clearly beneficial, and its time has come. Now, when it comes to resources on SCA or SBOM, it's entirely possible you're not fully up to speed with them, and there's a ton of resources out there. I've listed a few here from actual vendors of solutions. The reason I've done that is because all of these vendors have spent a lot of time trying to make it easy to understand what this stuff is. They're motivated to do so because their products and services hinge on it, but there's great value in checking their material and seeing their summaries. They do some really good jobs. Though if you want to really get something super useful, my recommendation is to look at things like what Microsoft said. A user company talking about how they solved for a problem is always going to be the most illustrative and most immediately applicable approach. And here, for example, you can see Microsoft talking about how they're addressing software bill of materials with SPDX. And if you want the mental model here, it's about software wanting to get the identification of software and its licenses right, and how they did that using an industry standard approach that can work for any company of any size in any sector. Let's bring this together a bit. There's been a lot of moving pieces here. I talked about government policies. I talked about how the industry has been maturing for 10 years, how SCA and SBOM are to the forefront of where we're at and what we're doing. Yep, open source is boring. We're sort of done with the exciting phase of open source, particularly around copyright. We had a slightly bumpy maturity period. Our teenage years were full of some confusions about how licenses could or should work. some confusions about how we manage that with relation to other software. But by and large, governments and companies are falling onto a simple consensus about copyright in open source that is, well, pretty much what we do with normal software. It's not that open source management is less important, but it's less singular, it's less special, and it's less fragmented from normal IP. Where previously we tended to put open source licenses on a pedestal of difference, it's increasingly clear that they're just another license. And there's a series of licenses in open source with commonalities, in the same way that you could have a series of licenses from a proprietary vendor across multiple products with commonalities. Fundamentally, managing that is not a different thing. And that's probably the biggest breakthrough in mental model in open source copyright in recent times. That's not to say everything is going super smoothly, and I'll come to that in a minute. What is smooth is that the policy activity is a strong indication of what's to come. Governments have no more time for open source being an outliner, something unregulated, or something regarded as a challenge to existing IP. Open source is just a thing, which is recommended by the governments to use. And that's really a taste of what you can expect across the policy spectrum this year. I see nothing to indicate that any government policy upcoming will do anything except emphasize the normality and utility of open source alongside other software. What is likely to happen is that we will see the pivot away from open source SCA, open source SBOMs, and open source automation. We will increasingly see people just talk about SCA, SBOM, and automation for all copyright issues related to software, a reflection of our actual market. There is very little out there that is pure play proprietary or pure play open source. Almost everything is hybrid. And the conversation has for too long treated stuff differently. Where we're going is the expectation that you treat everything in the same way, that you have a unified solution to work with. This might be hard for some departments and people. We've had a corner where we got to be very special for a very long time. And now folding into more generalized software composition analysis, SBOMs, and so on, will lead to a certain difference in the status of open source program offices, etc. But it goes the other way too. The SCA departments, which focused exclusively on proprietary software, will suddenly have to share their mental model with open source. What we mustn't lose sight of, though, is that not being special anymore is a good thing, not a bad thing. And on an institutional and a personal level, we need to roll with it. There are a few things to watch out for, and this is perhaps the important part of the talk. There are some things that can and should concern you as these evolutions are occurring. So the first thing I'd say is be careful not to be on the wrong side of SCA history. Are your services providers focused on a strong delineation between open source and proprietary software? If they are, that's not the future. You're going to have SCA that will address both in a unified manner to allow most effective management and decision making. So your service providers should be able to either support that today or have a plan to support that tomorrow. Another one is your open source team isolated from other aspects of your software management? If they are, that friction can and will introduce both errors and resource wastage. Those are two of the main things on the SCA front, I'd say. And they're important things to look at. If your SCA vendor is not supporting everything, you have to think very carefully about where the market's going and where the challenges will be there. If your open source team is operating in a silo, just like every other silo, suboptimal. And then, be careful of things that would place you on the wrong side of SBOM history. We do see people tend to use SBOMs in a manner which is tentative as opposed to comprehensive at this stage. A lot of companies are using SBOMs to manage open source license compliance. And they're doing that for a very good reason, because it improves their effectiveness in open source license compliance. Today, that can solve for their challenge area perfectly. But given that we're looking at a situation where everything is just SCA, SBOM, etc., where open source is no longer special, you have to think, is your SBOM positioning good for using SBOMs in a mixed software environment for both proprietary and open source software? The last thing you want to do is to end up in a situation where your proprietary components and your open source components are using different SBOMs. That's obviously not a good idea. And of course, a vital question, and something that comes up all the time in the OpenChain ecosystem, is, do you have a realistic way to get your ecosystem behind your SBOM concept and approach? When it comes down to it, what you do internally, if you're providing products and solutions to market based on open source platforms or based on physical products, if your supply chain isn't aligned with something like your SBOM approach, you're always going to be firefighting and doing remediation. You need to get that duck in a row. So I'd say those are the warning signs of what to look for with your SCA and SBOM strategic approaches in 2022. There's some good news too. Let's not be grim about all of this. This is an opportunity. The good news is copyright trawling around open source is dead. The only effective trawl, who was operational for the best part of a decade, has been litigated out of activity. So that little bit of special problem around open source is gone. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt around open source is also dead. Every major company in the world that I'm aware of is messaging in a way that's coherent around open source, as opposed to messaging in a way which is designed to undermine open source or threaten it. And the reason for that, of course, is that every major company in the world is an open source user. But it's an important milestone. It's an important milestone because trying to differentiate open source from other software was a hindrance to open source simply being software. So it's another step forward. And of course, the final thing that's good news is we actually have a plan. The ad hoc stuff we were doing for years has been formalized into ISO standards. We have extensive projects to support the global community, and we have activities to put out the fires on critical things like security. In case you're not aware of it, the Open Source Security Foundation, also a sister project in LF, is doing all kinds of things with working groups and serious capital to try to make sure that in the domain of open source collaborative development, security is effectively addressed. The future is promising. Things are looking pretty good. We have a situation which is probably better than at any time in the history of open source. And from the copyright perspective, the fact that the world is on message about these licenses, the fact that the aberrations like a copyright trawl are gone, is a promising indication that we have overcome all of the key challenges that we had before. Pulling the threads together. So the world is actually pretty grim. The world itself. The global supply chain remains broken because of COVID initially, and now a cascade of failures. War has led to increased scarcity in areas like semiconductors. Our neon from Ukraine is obviously on hold. I believe someone today, Armine, was telling me that one type of oil in Europe, I believe it was sunflower oil, 50% of the European stuff, 50% of the world's supply comes from Ukraine. So there we are. That's not good. Inflation is reaching historical levels. I saw the US was 7.2% in December 2021. It's not much better elsewhere. Even though Japan is reporting an inflation rate of 1 point something, the actual prices here have raised considerably. Fuel has gone up somewhere in the region of over 20% in the last month and a half. Living costs, energy to food are raising quickly. However, in our domain, our ability to manage the software supply chain is a lot better now. We've improved it at probably the ideal time as things get really messed up around the world. Now, because open source remains critical to infrastructure and any product or solution going to market, this puts us somewhat at the center of being a positive in this market. And our increased efficiency in our supply chains suggests that we will be a positive contributor to helping to offset the negativity in other areas of the globe. And believe it or not, this pertains to copyright and open source as well. The better we manage our copyright about open source and proprietary software, the better decisions we can make about sharing and selling. And the better decisions we make there, well, the benefits are obvious. Something like Linux has transformed our ability to make any type of product in the world. The fact that we're able to deal with open source much better now as part of just software is a strong indicator that this innovation train has just left the station. We've got a long way to go. The old Wild West of weird licensing, extremely volatile communities with strong personalities is basically a few dusty corners. The open source community is vast. It has a huge number of stakeholders, and the vast majority of our community, in terms of useful projects to market, is stuff that's pretty mature, pretty well governed, and pretty well supported. And where it's not, we are we're working on that. Mistakes happen. OpenSSL in 2014 was an example of an epic mistake. Another example of a mistake was when we saw SolarWinds happen, a supply chain breach. But we're getting better at it, and those dusty corners have become fewer and fewer every year. Where we are is in the center of the software galaxy, and there's no reason to believe that there's a negative take on open source copyright. In fact, quite the opposite. The only thing to be super cautious on this year is that you're positioning yourself for the realization of optimal management of hybrid software moving forward. Right, I am going to wrap up my little talk here. I do want to answer a question. We just had one from Mr. Perez, and I'm going to answer this question. Wait, I'm going to answer the second question first. Anonymous attendee, is this a promotion of a new closed chain? Let me answer this live. So a question came in, is this the promotion of a new closed chain? And the answer is no. We're talking about the supply chain, not blockchain. So OpenChain is a project building trust in the global supply chain. We maintain an ISO standard for license compliance. And we also work on things like reference standard for security. We've got policy, training documents, and so on. So supply chains is what we're doing. We're not doing blockchain. And while we have looked at blockchain on occasion as a potential utilization tool in the supply chain, you need to understand that our optics are very large. So a product to market, like an air conditioner, has got dozens of companies involved. And a lot of those companies are touching software. They all have to get their license compliance right to make sure that the software in the end product is good to go. If you send out something with mistakes on your license, if you have copyright problems, you open yourself up to issues ranging from cease and desist through to simply tarnishing your brand name. So we're really about how to make sure that those things don't happen. And the reason we're doing it is ultimately that we want to make sure products get to market really fast and we don't waste time and resources endlessly putting out fires and doing mitigation. We want to get it right because we want to get things done. Blockchain, if any, in the supply chain is a potential tool, but it's certainly a very small part of the picture. And I suppose the last thing I'd say is, if you're looking for blockchain and supply chain, join one of our mailing lists. We are talking about it, but it's just a small part of what we're doing. And today it's nothing to what we're doing, which is copyright law. Thank you for your question. Okay, Xavier, I'm going to deal with your question now. So you said, great presentation. What's your take on the fact? What's your take on the fact that SBOMs can get outdated very rapidly? Open source is constantly changing, new open source versions, end-of-life releases. This is a great question. And my take is that we need to delineate between the software bill of materials as a format, as a structure, versus what you're storing in that structure. So I'd really look at the issue you've raised as valid, but it's more an issue of database management. So, if people are using an SBOM format with a single way to describe software, then it becomes easier to see what you and your suppliers have done. It doesn't mean that you don't have to have processes in place for continually monitoring to make sure that the description saying this is version 8.2 matches the code itself. But I think that's, I think what that is a process management issue that we can manage with manual or automated processes regarding touch points. And OpenChain does this for license compliance. And we've got a reference specification for doing this in security. And here's how we do it. Basically, we say at the inbound part, where you take software into your company, you should identify what is it. And by identify what is it, we're talking, what's this package, what's its version, what's its license. Internally, when you have a touch point on the software, when a team picks it up and starts working with it, they should do the same. And externally, when you're getting ready to ship, you should do the same. And if you have those process touch points and you have a structured, standardized SBOM language, you should be okay, even with the fact that software is evolving rapidly. It doesn't mean the problems will go away. Someone will forget to update a version number, and something will have to be fixed. And when that happens, because you're using a unified language, you can go back quickly and see who messed up. And that isn't a blame game. It's really about saying, you messed up here, your process broke, how do we fix that? And remember, we're always thinking supply chain, internal and external. So it's always about, how do we keep this process flowing? And every time we find a problem with the process, how do we make sure that problem goes away? So yeah, the answer is, it's a problem with maintaining SBOMs. It's addressed by good processes. It won't be addressed with a panacea. You're looking at a situation where you're continually going to have to improve. But at least if you're using a single SBOM language, that will allow you to know department to department, company to company, how to look back and remediate really fast, and hopefully not have to remediate again on that point. Anonymous attendee, do you suggest any, well, just hit answer live. Anonymous attendee asked, do you suggest any specific SBOM format? It's possible to suggest them. In our community of OpenChain, most people are looking at and using SPDX. SPDX is about a decade old. It was released into the market at a much earlier stage of open source maturity. And alongside open source, it matured. SPDX is now an ISO standard as of last year, and it's a very useful SBOM format. But it's not the only one out there. There are other SBOM formats. There's Cyclone DX, which originated in the security domain, I believe. And while it's got a slightly narrower total scope than SPDX. It's used by companies, and it's another example. There's another example called SWID. This is an older ISO standard, and I don't think it's used much anymore. But it's out there. It's a standard that's standardized, and it's useful to have. What I would recommend is that people don't try to roll their own SBOM format. It completely defeats the purpose. So you want the supply chain to be using one SBOM format, or maybe two, or maybe three, but not dozens, because we're already doing dozens of spreadsheets with unique asks by suppliers and by customers, and that's a train wreck. You want standardized formats so that one supplier addressing 20 customer companies isn't juggling 20 different asks, because they're supplying often the same software to these companies, but they have to reformat things, and inevitably stuff goes wrong. Yep, so that's it in a nutshell. There are some formats. SPDX is an ISO standard. It's very current. Lots of people are using it. SWID is an older ISO standard. I don't think so many people are using it. Cyclone DX is a de facto standard, and it's got an active community and so on. Okay, there was a great follow-on question. There's a question from Yari, but there's an immediate follow-on on the SBOM formats that I'm going to answer before swinging back to Yari. So our anonymous attendee, same person I'm guessing, said, do converters exist to go between formats? And you know what? I don't think there are enough converters that I've seen that do that. No, so I think to some extent, maybe, but I have not yet seen transparent tools that are like the magic SBOM converter. But conceptually, that's not super difficult. So it's really a case, I guess, of market demand pull. Am I aware of tools that do it? Nope. Is it possible to do it? Absolutely. If it exists already, let me know. If it doesn't exist, well, come to the OpenChain tooling work group and let's start talking about it, and let's start building it. I'm going to go to Yari's question, which is, are there already products, closed source or open source, for CI/CD SBOM? And then he asked a second question, do we need another playbook or guide? That's an OpenChain question. OpenChain dives into market areas where there's a hole, and we build guidance. Products for CI/CD SBOM. I believe that a lot of the software composition products, proprietary products, out there are able to support this to some extent. Several of the vendors, such as Synopsys, have told me that they support SPDX. Whether they export ingest and export of SPDX transparently, I am not sure if they're fully behind the ISO standard yet. If you're one of their customers, tell them you want it. I think they are, but I'm not sure. I'm not at the cutting edge of their current product development. But yeah, basically, there's plenty of proprietary tooling for CI/CD, which has at least nominal support for SPDX at least. And the companies, all of them that I've talked to, have emphasized that they are interested in the ingest and export of SPDX as an ISO standard, right? Oh, cool. We had an anonymous note. Just started testing SPDX export in Black Duck, working on understanding ingest functionality. Okay, so thank you very much, anonymous attendee. What would be cool here would be for the community to come back to us and tell us how the tools are working for them in practice. Yari, you said, do we need another playbook or guide for SBOM CI/CD? There's a lot of open source tooling for open source compliance, and some of it is pretty good. In fact, it's fantastic. And we're seeing it becoming more and more prevalent across the market. And a lot of it works for CI/CD. So some of the really good tooling out there, I think that we need to talk about It originates in places like Germany. We've seen some great tooling come out of companies like Bosch, Here Technologies, and Siemens. That effectively supports CI/CD, and I think that we can probably work with them to make some playbooks and guides, and yes, we should do it in OpenChain. And by coincidence, which I'm sure Yari knows, we actually have an automation summit coming up in May, so that's obviously when we'll be releasing that documentation. We have a question here about lawsuits related to misuse of open source licenses. Is that a major issue? The answer is there have been lawsuits about open source licenses in multiple jurisdictions. For example, there was a lawsuit recently in China. Open source is interesting because we have a lot of third-party IP, but we have seen very few lawsuits, which is counterintuitive because we're working with each other's intellectual property, each other's copyright, but we rarely have a conflict. I think it's because the fundamental positioning of our field is that we're trying to collaborate on software platforms. And if something goes wrong, in virtually every case I've ever seen in the last 20 years, it's because of a mistake. And because we're collaborating for the purpose of collaborating, when a mistake happens, everyone is interested in trying to resolve it rather than, prolong it in court. That said, there are lawsuits, and there have been cease and desist, and they have been effective. You'll see effective lawsuits, especially in Germany. And if you want to search for them, I suggest that you search for lawsuits from an organization now defunct, essentially, an organization called gplviolations.org. That's gpl-violations.org. GPL Violations in Germany did amazing work at enforcing open source licensing in Germany. I believe it was the first lawsuit around GPL licensing ever occurred through them. And they did a spectacular, positive job about making open source licensing super effective. In fact, on the line, there's Dr. Till Jaeger. He's one of our attendees, and he's the guy behind initially enforcing the GPL v2 in Germany. In terms of, he's the lawyer guy. There was a wonderful developer person leading that initiative who's now doing other amazing stuff in open source called Harold Velte. And there was another person very active in gplviolations.org who's now focused on really great analysis, and that's Armine Hemmel, who will be talking in a bit. But yeah, there are lawsuits. Is it a major issue? Absolutely not. It's a weirdly small issue, but that's because we're trying to collaborate on the platforms to save time and money. We much prefer to solve a problem than prolong it. Stephen, Mr. Glubane comes in. Since license compliance and security are now boring and done, how about export compliance and open source? Yeah, open source. Okay, so I wouldn't say security is boring, but I definitely say license compliance. The copyright side of license compliance and open source is boring and done. I think security is getting more exciting, and particularly right now, we've seen a cascade of innovative security breaches on open source and proprietary software with the Ukrainian war. Right. Security is one of those things where I think it's not boring, but we know what to do. Open source license compliance is now boring enough that we can fold it into general software license compliance. Export compliance, that is a hot topic. It's something that has been put on the shelf in OpenChain to be answered, and we are going to be working on it this year. We're going to be working on it very soon, making a new guide on export control. Similar to how we did with security, you can expect it to start small and evolve to be as effective as possible, and then we'll let the market decide what to do. So with security, in August 2021, we released a guide because lots of people were using our license compliance standard for security. They were using ISO 5230 license compliance in open source for security, which is fine. but we wanted to make sure that companies that weren't sophisticated in the domain could use the standard as effectively as possible in security. We wrote a guide. And then people said, the guide is okay, but there's a whole bunch of security stuff we need to work on. So we expanded the guide into what is now a reference security standard. It's a sister to OpenChain ISO 5230. It's a sister to the compliance standard, and it's not necessarily ever going to be released as a de facto or formal standard, but it exists to give you a mental model of how to do security and open source and to make it super easy to understand, especially if you've looked at OpenChain. We've had some great people like Chris Wood, who's also on the line, bringing their deep, deep, deep experience in the security domain to making sure that's as good as possible. You'll learn more about that on our main mailing list because we're always talking about it. Export compliance, back to your point, Steve. Yeah, we're building a guide for that. As soon as we release the new version of the security document, which is, next week, then we move on to export control. And export control has accidentally become a super hot topic because now we have massive global sanctions on Russia, and we have counter sanctions and so on and so forth. So that's something we will be solving for really soon to make sure it's on your desks really fast. Apologies, Stephen. I didn't hit answer live, but everyone, that was Stephen's question, and it was a very good one. We've got another question from Anonymous and one from Endosan. I'm going to answer the Anonymous question first and then go to Endosan. Is there any tool I suggest to provide SPDX report creating manually is time consuming? Absolutely. I recommend you go and look at the open source tools that support SPDX. So the first thing I'd say to you is come to the OpenChain website, join our tooling work group. You'll find it under community. And they will be able to literally tell you the best open source tools, they cost nothing, to get started with making SPDX reports. There's a whole bunch of tools, open source tools, small light ones from the SPDX project through to full SCA solutions. And all of these are available for you to test and try. They're open source code maintained by user companies for user companies. A follow-on question would be, if there's such advanced open source tools, why are there proprietary vendors? The answer is, to use an open source tool for open source license compliance is a decision-making process that often requires a company to have some people who are good at setting up open source tools. And therefore, there's a small barrier to entry. In that case, it might be more useful to work with a vendor who has a proprietary solution. The open source community is definitely working to make the open source tools so simple. It's just click and play. And that's naturally a healthy market pressure on the proprietary tooling vendors, both for features and for pricing. But yes, there are plenty of tools for SPDX reports. Go to openchain.org/community, or just click the community tab, join the tooling work group, and you will get direct help on all the options. Someone said, can we move on to the next topic? The answer is not yet. I have to answer Endosan's question, but it's a good question. Thank you. Endosan, what do you think about the need for standardization of rules for sharing SBOM within the supply chain? I think it's very high, Endosan, and I think that we're going to have shared processes for sharing this stuff. We don't yet have all the glue in place. We have the SBOM formats like SPDX. We have process inflection points like OpenChain, which tells you where to do something. We might need a little more work, as you said, on the rules for sharing SBOM in the supply chain. One thing, and this applies to proprietary software as well as open source, one thing we haven't really got is a really smart way to have some information very public, some information private, but all the information accessible very fast across dozens of companies in one product supply chain. So yeah, we need to do some stuff on that. And the preview is that actually the OpenChain project will be doing something about this with a concept for receipts that are either very clear, very public, or private, and they can be both accessible by everyone, but keep information private where needed. In other words, filling in that dark spot between process, SBOM format, and then the last point of the rules for sharing. We're working on it. Right, no open questions after that. Thank you very much indeed. I see some people have been chatting in the chat, but I'm assuming that these chats are a side note to the main conversation. And I will, at this juncture, hand over to Keith Burgelt, CEO of Open Invention Network, to talk about patents in open source.
Thanks very much, Shane. I'm not sure that I can start the video without you, but anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and quite remarkable to see the growth of OpenChain and the level of interest that's been generated, as well as just corporate participation, individual support. It's not surprising because, just a side note before I really begin my substantive comments, Shane built the European legal network pretty much single-handedly, then evolved to work with me for the better part of 6 years to provide an incredible foundation for the growth that we've experienced at OIN, and it's been wonderful to watch, but as I said, not surprising to see OpenChain become such a vital community of individuals from around the world, and to see a standard developed, and it's really quite powerful. And it's not something that can ever be taken for granted. People who can authentically build community are few and far between, but it's a tribute to his authenticity, the simplicity of the message, and the importance of the work. And so I applaud the effort that Shane has put out, and the result speaks for itself. What I want to do today is talk about patents, what's happening in patent non-aggression, how companies are working together, recognizing their own interdependencies with open source. The growth of open source over the last 15 years that I've been working as CEO of OIN has been amazing. Not the least of which is the growth of large company participation, which is, I think, critically important in providing real movement of the overall community and growth of projects. We can stay there. Armand, thank you. Armand's driving, and it'll flow from my presentation to his presentation when he's on to speak. But what we're noticing, before I go into kind of a discussion of how OIN is tracking with the evolution of change and the migration of risk in the open source world, and some of the things that we're looking at as ways to mitigate risk with the new challenges that are approaching. Because of, I think, symbolic importance, yes, but also fundamentally representative of the shift in corporates to recognize the value and importance and essentiality of open source in building an increasing number of software-enabled technologies and products, is the signing of Microsoft 3.5 years ago to the OIN license. I think it was an incredible gesture, but it's much more than that for the company. As I spend more and more time in Seattle and around the world, even in COVID, I think I've had more visits in Seattle during COVID than any other place in the world. not just because it's open and COVID's been managed well, but because of the desire to kind of work with people who are, in this case, a prodigal, but a very, very wonderful example of how transition can occur and how change can occur in individuals and mindsets, as well as in business models, to be able to support initiatives like OIN, but more importantly, to support the whole modality of open innovation that is part and parcel of the open source community. And so as we start to travel a bit more and talk to more companies, we're hearing the same thing more broadly, that open source is essential, is something that is not going away. And what I've always thought, it's a social movement, which is very difficult. You don't, unlike technologies, which maybe can be worked around or essentially be overtaken by events. A social movement is a very pernicious thing. It stays with us. It's invasive. It changes the cultures around it and draws people in. And the power of that cannot be understated, or overstated rather, in that that so many companies from around the world, be it from some of the industries that we have had particular success with in the last 5 or 6 years, or the regions that we've had success, like China, but so many places where software is becoming important, open source is having a profound positive impact. And so I'll talk a little bit about the patent trends after I kind of introduce what OIN is for those of you who might not be familiar with it. OIN was started in the fall of 2005, and the mission was to enable open source, to enable adoption, to encourage freedom of choice, freedom to operate, to allow companies to make better choices about the technologies that they incorporate into their products and that support their services. And OIN is first and foremost about building community. We don't have a forcing function that requires people to join. We rely on again, exactly what Shane is talking about, and what Shane's done with OpenChain is we rely on people recognizing that our equities are actually aligned, and that this notion of co-opetition has never had a stronger foundation than it has under open source. The whole idea that we collaborate to compete more effectively, that we create new value together more effectively than we can individually. This is so fundamental and so important, and many companies are understanding not only that technology is there and available, but they're understanding that these technologies are ones that are critically important to the future of their business. As I said, it was established in 2005. IBM, Red Hat at the time when it was independent, SUSE, which was Novell at the time, NEC, Sony, and Philips were the original founders. Google and Toyota joined more recently, as you'll see in 13 and 16. And since its founding, it's become the largest patent non-aggression community in the history of the tech sector, and really worked hand in glove with the Linux Foundation, with Apache, and other project management organizations around the world to ensure that we are providing patent protection to be able, and patent non-aggression, to be able to enable companies to make good decisions about which technologies they want to include in their products, and supporting that support their services, and specifically to make open source something that is user friendly and comfortable. And as Shane said, we passed the point where fear, uncertainty, and doubt were guiding the behaviors and controlling the adoption rates for open source. It's a new era, but it's not an era without risk. As in the patent space, the dynamic that I just described of the realization of the importance of does not necessarily signal that that the threat is gone from the patents that that operating companies once owned, because they have shifted and migrated. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide, please. And so right now we have almost 3,700 companies that are part of the OIN community, some of the largest companies in the world, the most significant multi-industrial companies in the world, like Hitachi, to some of the smallest companies that are one or two person shops that are doing software development. We have captured or encumbered over 3 million patents that are now part of the cross license, and those that are subject to the cross license are ones that read on open source functionality contained in what we call the Linux system definition, which is a living, breathing system. It expands every two to 3 years to include more and more functionality coming out of significant open source projects. There are thousands of projects that are represented by what code is contained in the Linux system definition, and it establishes the scope of the cross-license obligation that companies have to each other as a result of the OIN license. We own over 1,000 patents and applications. We spent $100 million acquiring patents to support the defensive or counteroffensive activities that were necessary to deal in the early days, in particular, of open source. When companies, many companies, not just Microsoft, but many companies had not really understood the value of open source and the expected norms of participating in this community. As I said, this is a social movement, and there are norms and a code of conduct that's necessary for us to participate effectively and to be authentic. There are over 3,500 packages that are core Linux and more broadly open source packages that are covered under the Linux system definition, and a complete listing is available on the website. Everything we do is transparent and available. The patents we own, the packages that are included in the broad cross license that exists, and we have an open door to nominations by individuals and companies and organizations like the LF. The LF is a regular nominator. Many of its projects have contributed nominations on a regular basis. And the same is true with Mike Milinkovich's projects and many, many others. Next slide, please. And the important thing to me, and one of the things that was really a point of focus for me when I took this role almost 15 years ago, is that I wanted to ensure that as OIN grew, that it was very much a global organization that was about inclusion, not a club of large companies, but rather something that was providing benefit across the spectrum of sectors, of geographies, as well as technologies and corporate entities and individuals. We have some of the most famous open source kind of the guides of open source from the earliest days that are part of our community that don't necessarily want to be known as being signatories, but the scope of signatories is also very important. Like from the organizations that founded and supported the growth of GNU Linux and Linux and many other critical projects to the freshly born companies that are now taking advantage of open source to be able to grow business models and to be innovative. OIN is a model that's built on free membership. We don't have a capacity to develop revenue, and it was thoughtfully designed in that regard so that there's no concern around OIN not having authenticity and not being being clearly focused on supporting, again, that mission of freedom to operate and freedom of choice, and the whole notion of enabling adoption of open source. And so we're everywhere because you're everywhere, and we're looking to provide support wherever you happen to be. This is not about North America. This is not about Europe. This is not about Asia only. This is about everywhere. And the growth has been incredibly significant in Asia in particular over the last 7 years. Next slide, please. This just gives you an example of where the percentages are in terms of individual entities that are part of our community. And I'm particularly proud of this, as I said, that we have not we are not underrepresented in penetration and support around the world because the world is changing. There are, as I said, operating company risk is declining, but patent assertion entity risk is on the rise. And that's a troubling trend because these are entities without ideology and without the ability, without businesses that one might counterclaim against. So it's become a very important point of focus for us. And I'll talk a little bit about other ideas and activities that we are involved in to be able to work against risks in the open source world. Next slide, please. This just gives you a sense of how we think about the world. We really live in the slipstream of major project management organizations and their projects. We have just started dialogue with OpenAtom and hope that the 5 projects that are the foundational projects of OpenAtom will yield core code that can be considered for inclusion in the Linux system definition. Apache, Linux Foundation, Eclipse, OpenStack. These projects have contributed significant amounts of code of these project management organizations. In the case of OpenStack, it was the project name, but now it's migrated as well to manage multiple projects. And so we have a technical committee internally of OAN's, made up of OAN's funding members that consider and evaluate nominations, along with the director of our initiative that manages the technical committee activity. That's on my team, who's on my team. And then we have a technical advisory council that started out as a half dozen companies that has now grown to almost 20. We expect that number to rise as individual companies who are interested in understanding the process and being a little bit closer to the process and helping to nominate as well as review package nominations and understand their potential value as part of the Linux system definition. That review and vetting process is a very important one. And ultimately, through this process of living in the slipstream of major projects and having very close relationships with project management organizations under which those projects are housed, we have been working in a very purposeful way to clear risk so that that adoption of open source code coming out of these projects can be done without fear or concern of patent risk. Next slide, please. And another important component of what we do is the idea that there's technical and legal collaboration. I think we tend not to think about, we think about the technical collaboration all the time because companies are coming together, they join projects, they take code, they contribute code, they adhere to a set of norms in terms of behaviors, what Shane just described in terms of the copyright side, the idea of governance, having an overarching view around how compliance works on the copyright side is very important and part of a kind of embodied knowledge that companies develop by working with each other, learning from each other, and sharing best practices as a matter of course. But a lot of that is done on the legal side. And so it's not just a technical collaboration. There's a great deal of collaboration, the legal network that I said, that the European legal network that's now a global legal network that Shane founded, and with me founded the Asian legal network to ensure that there was focus on sharing best practices with and among Asian lawyers. these are all really important components of how open source exists. It's not, the collaborative development is not just technical, but it actually is legal. And we have a great group of companies that are represented and individuals from those companies with varying levels of knowledge that recognize that high tide raises all boats. We all need to be better. We all need to work together to be able to have better compliance practices, to understand supply chain issues, to make sure that we are not damaging the progress of open source through a lack of focus, or in some cases it's just lack of awareness of what's necessary in order to participate in the community. And that's why I describe it as a set of norms or code of conduct as to what's important and why compliance is so important, why thinking about how you use your patent portfolio in the most appropriate way possible, recognizing where you can differentiate. If you are going to utilize patents, how can you utilize them in a constructive, positive way versus the negative ways that we potentially see that are risk presenting. And so I think these are important components of this parallelism, is that we recognize that the legal community is one that needs very much to practice the same level of collaboration and sharing to really get to the point where we are not damaging in any way or being neglectful in a way that would limit the adoptability of code and limit the opportunities for companies to come together. We want to encourage that through managing legal issues well, and we do that on the copyright and on the patent side, but also on the trademark side. In many projects, the trademarks are quite important. Next slide, please. This just gives you an example of the kinds of packages that are included in the Linux system definition. And the name Linux system definition was a legacy. We've never changed it, but we include far more than Linux in the cross-license obligation zone. And we continue to migrate and include more and more as new projects are developed. Clearly automotive grade Linux, the container projects, SNCF, so many projects that are the networking projects. There's so many projects, security projects, mobility. There's so many areas that have arisen. We started out with 1,100 pretty much common base packages and some software engineering packages, and we've really expanded to go from 1,100 packages at our founding to now over 3,500, and that number's rising. We expect that we'll have another update to the Linux system definition in mid-2023, and continue to solicit more and more nominations and contributions of important code from across the community. Next slide, please. This just gives you an example of the breadth of the community, the kinds of companies that are represented. There are so many companies now that when I'm asked a question about a particular company as to whether they're in the community, I sometimes have to go back and check our website to make sure that I'm recalling everyone that's now part of our community. And I can assure you that when I came into this, there were 31 companies, and I knew every one of them. And I knew all the companies that we were looking to bring into the community and build around. You look at companies like Huawei, that's a great accomplishment. It's Microsoft on the same list, and Alibaba, and SK and Verizon, and just the AT&Ts of the world. AT&T, the most successful monetized patent monetization telecommunications carrier in the history of the world, recognized that it was more important to be part of the community and to expose its patents to all of its patents to the OIN cross license because of the importance of open source to them in their strategy as a company. And so I think that's testament to right there to the fact that, IBM, another one that, very successful patent monetization program, but lives with it an embodied duality, understanding that open and proprietary coexist. And how to manage and how to understand that you can expose your patent portfolio to cross license, but at the same time recognize that you can be authentic within the community. Next slide, please. And banking and financial services is growing dramatically. We are adding more and more companies. We just actually signed Royal Bank of Canada the other day, so this list continues to grow. Barclays, Ant Financial, the largest transaction machine in the world on a daily basis. SMBC, one of the hyper banks in Japan. The crypto companies, transaction companies like Square, foreign banks like TD Bank and Barclays, as I said, domestic banks like Truist in the U.S. Automotive sector, there are very, very, very few automakers that are not part of our community, and now we're putting an intense focus on bringing in the suppliers. If we can go to the next slide, please. Again, just industrials, another notable area. When I first met with Caterpillar and Komatsu and some of the companies in this space, I was somewhat surprised 6 or 7 years ago that they had so much awareness of how their businesses were going to be changed by software, and how they were looking to open source as a solution to be able to facilitate the acceleration of their move to more software intensity. Energy companies, I think the rise of and the re-networking of the grids in many countries to make them more efficient and to support different dynamics in terms of power consumption across countries, I think is very powerful as well. And the semiconductor space, I'll talk more about this as we go forward, but it's nice to see that we have embedded companies because there's a big transition coming in open hardware that many of these companies and others will be part of. Next slide, please. Media and entertainment, IT, most of the major, we just talked with Atos yesterday, and we expect them to be our next signatory. Some of the largest systems integration companies and software development companies and IT services, the hardware companies of the world, consumer electronics companies. This is very encouraging to see all of these companies part of this community. Next slide, please. And so OAN does a number of things. It supports patent risk mitigation through its cross-license. It gives companies more comfort in adopting open source code. It's at no monetary cost. We are funded by our investors. And OAN membership is the only thing that people would pay for if they want to become a full member. But that's a group of just 8 entities right now, and we don't spend a lot of time recruiting companies to join. At certain points, it makes sense for companies, as Google and Toyota evidenced in the last decade, have joined. Defensive support is something we don't publicize a lot, but we have worked with literally hundreds of companies that were at risk or in litigation to identify prior art, to be able to help them to be able to make sense of situations that for some small to medium-sized companies, litigation can be daunting and destabilizing. To help them by hiring counsel to work with them, to be able to provide guidance in how they deal with prospective litigation related to patents, how they build their patent portfolios, how they grow a defensive positioning to allow them to be independent and to be free from patent risk. These are all things that we've done on a regular basis. And as a result of that, OAN has become kind of a litmus test for authenticity in the open source community. It's not something that we set out as a goal, but I think through the trust that we've developed in the community, and the comfort that people have with the fact that we are being reasonable and rational in how we expand the scope of the cross license, and that we are a guardian and steward of freedom in the community. The trust and comfort in that positioning for OIN is something I'm very proud of, and it comes from having talented, authentic people like Shane, who's worked with me for, as I said, for 6 years, and the other people that are now part of my team. We are first and foremost focused on community values, and then focused on the operation of our model to be able to ensure that risk is mitigated associated with patents. We've got to read on open source functionality. Next slide, please. What we've been doing during COVID is focusing a great deal of attention on RISC-V and open source hardware. We have had, as you've seen from the earlier slides, we've had great success, unprecedented success in creating a community around the general notion of freedom to operate and freedom of action in the core of open source and Linux. And we have been asked a little over 2 years ago, right before COVID, to see whether our model could potentially be used to ensure that RISC-V and open source hardware in general could be inoculated from risk, so that there would not be, from patent risk, so that there would not be an attempts to slow or stall the progress of what appear to be incredible growth engines for open source, and a vehicle to allow for heightened innovation in the embedded space, which I think is something that every company, from the most successful embedded companies in the world to the smallest, more maverick RISC-V companies, everybody recognizes that we need more innovation, and the path to getting it appears that RISC-V is here. The hardware, software, co-design, and simulation tools that are so vital are finally ready and mature. And some of them are fully open source, some of them are some hybrid version, but what we're seeing is tooling has caught up and software has caught up to enable hardware to be produced in this way. And I think the traditional embedded companies are adapting and evolving. If you look at the Intel announcements over the last 4 weeks, and if you listen to the leadership of Intel, you see that Intel is making its own pivot to be able to accommodate the world that will be, and is not satisfied to live in the world that is. Next slide, please. And so we convened a working group to develop a common understanding of what the equivalent of the Linux system definition would be, but in this case, an open source hardware definition. We've developed and designed risk profiles to understand who has the patents that are most threatening, and to understand the motivations of those companies. Are they a threat? Could they become a threat under certain circumstances? Are they monolithic threats, multi-party threats? What does the community look like? What is the level of patent risk that we see, and how will it evolve as RISC-V becomes more and more successful? And other open source hardware. I mean, the CHIPS Alliance certainly looks a lot of tooling and looks at a number of elements that support the kind of the emergence of RISC-V, and more designed to meet specifications rather than generic designs that have to be built around in a suboptimal way. And then projects like the Open Compute project, very important project. Maybe the technology that's produced is not as sexy, but if we can reduce power, reduce footprint, and save costs associated with the operation of data centers, that project is incredibly important and is not to be misunderstood. And the number of the elements that come out of that project are not outside the scope of where patents are held. In fact, there have been a number of litigations associated with some of the more fundamental standard-based elements of that are coming out of the Open Compute project. And so we need to be very active. You also look at hardware enabled by software in AV1. If we're going to have dramatic change in the codec space, we have to start somewhere. And I think where Google and Microsoft and a number of other companies that are active supporters of AV1 is in the middle of trying to ensure that there's stewardship and there's guardianship of AV1 so that it can find traction, and that the codec world can be one that's more open than it certainly has been historically. And so we've looked at emulating our software model, our software license model to an open source hardware model, and to develop, importantly, what is it that we could protect in a hardware space, and how can it be analogous to the Linux system definition in terms of what we have in the scoping of a cross license at prospective launch. We are in the development phase, the feasibility study phase, but we are putting significant effort and capital and bringing in literally dozens of companies to be able to think with us and think through this, that have a vested interest in either as hyper users or as companies from the embedded space, or companies that are the hyper user category includes all the cloud companies, of course, but also multi-industrial companies that use literally thousands and thousands of chips to be able to develop their products. And so, next slide, please. The thing that's happening that affects software and hardware, though, is that as on the software side, as we've experienced a lessening or reduction in threat from the operating companies. Operating companies are selling their patents at record numbers, and they're being purchased by non-practicing entities. And that's a problem, because non-practicing entities, as I said, don't have any ideology and don't have operating businesses that are at risk in the event they decide to litigate and assert their patents. And so these are entities that are only concerned about return on investment, and as a result, they will manage multiple litigations at one time. They become very, very active because the open source functionality is adopted in such a widespread fashion across multiple industries. There's more and more opportunity space for patents that read on that functionality to be used to create disruption, create friction, and we want to always avoid that. And so one thing, that's just a series of things that we've done in the last few years in particular, is to manage a three-pronged program. One is to attack poor quality patent applications that are held by operating companies and patent assertion entities. Some patent assertion entities just don't buy and monetize. Some will actually develop significant portfolio activity, so they curate their portfolios, and the patents that they acquire get further developed and expanded. And so entities like Intellectual Ventures, if you've heard of them, they're very active and historically have been very active in curating portfolios, not just acquiring and monetizing. And so we've looked at their patents and contributed significant amounts of prior art over the years to have their patents, patent claims either rejected and applications rejected, or to have claim scope reduced dramatically so that the harm, once those patents are granted, will be far less than it otherwise would be the case. And so that's been an ongoing activity for us, really for much longer than the last few years. That's been the last 7 years. And we're one of the largest filers of pre-issuance submissions that help to limit the negative effects of new applications once granted. In addition, 2.5 years ago, we got together with the Linux Foundation and IBM and Microsoft to found and fund the Open Source Zone of Unified Patents, which is largely an inter partes review program, which is essentially just a way of attacking poor quality already granted patents that should have never been granted, that have overly broad claims that read on open source functionality. Those patents are ones that we see as particularly damaging. So we have been working with Unified Patents and with the other companies I mentioned to ensure, and with the Linux Foundation, obviously, to ensure that that individual patents that are particularly damaging can be attacked and invalidated, so that they cannot do harm to the community and hold up and raise the cost of ownership of utilization of open source code. And so that program has gone well. We've just renewed over the last 3 months our support for that program, and Facebook has joined in support as well. What we have just announced in the last 2 weeks is a program designed to, unlike the Unified Patents Open Source Zone, which is a rifle shot kind of program designed to target specific one-off patents. What we also wanted was a way of providing an opportunity for clearance from risk associated with patent assertion entities by creating syndication opportunities with third-party intermediaries that have established relationships with patent assertion entities. Rather than have to license a very large portfolio or license only a couple of patents that are open source related, when there are potentially hundreds of others that are open source related in an open source, in a PAE's patent assertion entities portfolio. By working with these third-party intermediaries, they've understood our issues and our concerns and have developed agreements with patent assertion entities to allow for sliver licenses or field of use licenses, where all patents are encumbered, but those that are in the PAE's portfolio, but those that relate to open source functionality are licensed out of the whole portfolio. And we've developed a very broad definition. Karen Copenhaver from the Linux Foundation has worked with me and with the third-party intermediaries to ensure that there was sufficient breadth to ensure that all open source related patents would be covered under these sliver licenses or field of use licenses, and that's been that's now out in the marketplace. The whole idea there is that third-party intermediaries have developed programs that are specifically designed to support the large open source community that OIN represents, of companies that are concerned and have committed their own patent portfolios to cross-license and want to be able to have the ability to further reduce risk from patent assertion entities by participating in these sliver licenses or field of use licenses that relate to only open source functionality. By doing syndications, the total cost per company is more modest than it is if you went and approached a patent assertion entity, and it's not something that they would readily do for individual companies, but they've done it for the OIN community because of the size and scope of the community, and because they want to be efficient about doing what they do. And so the costs can be a factor less than what they are in the open market to gain access to these patents through these third-party intermediary negotiations with the patent assertion entities. Again, so the first two are that are now available for consideration deal with a whole range of technologies that are very, very commonly understood and utilized, such as Kubernetes, Hadoop, Docker, Kafka, and many, many others that are in the claims of patents that are held by these non-practicing entities. And so we're looking to work with our members to offer them this unique benefit through these third-party intermediaries. And we've done a series of informational sessions that are actually ongoing every day at 10 and 2 for the next week or so. And for the last week, we've been doing informational sessions to sensitize people to the patents and the intermediaries that can provide more information to them and help them understand whether these opportunities are meaningful and beneficial to each individual company that expresses an interest. As I said, these are lower cost and an approach that is a license, sliver license, field of use base that is not available anywhere from patent assertion entities except to companies that are part of the OIN community. And so we're excited about the prospects here. And these are the kinds of creative things that that we find need to be done in order to deal with this evolving risk. And it applies not only in the software side, but it also applies in hardware. Next slide, please. And this is just another example of how these assets are being purchased by PEs, what's being acquired, and where we can expect to see flashpoints where risk is expected to occur. And if you look at the semiconductor space, it's not being neglected. And that's a concern to us. If you look at software and semiconductors, and electronics, these are the areas where so many of the innovations in open source are having significant benefit, and where we can expect that open source hardware will potentially need support and need an entity like OIN to be able to enable freedom of action, freedom of operation through a shared cross-license, but then also need support against patent assertion entities that will look to take advantage of the success of RISC-V and other open source hardware projects. Next slide, please. The whole idea is that this is, as I described earlier, and many companies that I was highlighting understand that this co-opetition, this collaborative development embodied in open source hardware and software doesn't signal a demise of intellectual property, but rather it's a balancing, it's an understanding of this practice duality is necessary, understanding where patents can be potentially beneficial from a defensive standpoint, and where patenting doesn't need to occur because it's irrelevant. You can't differentiate in areas where collaboration is occurring without being a pariah. And no company really wants to position itself that way. So rethinking how intellectual property and particularly patent filings are done in an open source software and hardware world is very important. Next slide, please. And so that's my those are my thoughts, and to give you a sense of how things are evolving in this world. And while we have had tremendous success in neutralizing the risk from operating companies, there's more work to be done. Patent assertion entities on the software side and the hardware side, and bringing together a community to replicate the success we've had, emulate the success we've had at OIN on the software side, but for hardware companies seeking to innovate at a rapid rate in RISC-V and beyond. So thank you very much, Shane, for the opportunity to be here. And any questions, I'd be glad to take them now or later.
Thank you very much indeed, Keith. You know, it's always critical to have you and OIN as the center point of where we do patents and open source. And the sheer size of the community around OIN, I think, is breathtaking, and the impact on the larger market of software cannot be underestimated. And what you're doing in hardware is something that I'd love to bring you back to speak with us in more detail about someday. I think a lot of our community might be interested in a special deep dive regarding open hardware, patents, and strategy. So if you'd be amenable to it, let's swing back to that someday and have a special hour on it or so.
Sure, glad to.
Great. Just checking if we've got any questions right now. And of course, yes, we have one question in. It's from Martin, and he's asking, do you see any difference between open source licenses with and without patent clauses? Do you want to take that, or do you want me to do it?
Are we talking about the copyright?
We're looking at BSD versus Apache.
Yeah.
In essence.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you look at the way I typically answer the question is that one of the great when I met with Jim Zemlin, must have been 13 years ago, when largely he was the managing. It's 14 years ago. He's managing a very important project, obviously Linux, but he hadn't started to expand to create opportunities for particularly large companies to participate in well-managed and curated projects, as has evolved now with the 390 projects that I think Linux Foundation has under it. And the decision was explicitly to not use the GPL. Clearly the kernel is under the GPL, but for the projects to be done under permissive licenses. And because permissive licenses have very weak patent provisions, unlike GPL v3, it meant that it wasn't an option to kind of engage in a project without thinking carefully about the complementary component of patent protection and cross-license and risk mitigation that OIN provides. And so our growth has been largely facilitated by the choices that not only Jim, but Mike and other people in various projects, Jonathan at OpenStack, but all of these projects being done under licenses that have very weak patent provisions have actually enabled OIN to be a complementary piece that is not really an option for companies that look carefully at their participation, but it's an essential component of good hygiene when one participates in open source software projects. And it was by design that was the case. This wasn't something that Jim thought of. It was something that we talked about extensively. And how this would work and why it was important to work closely with the technology leadership and the project leads at each of the projects that he has. And the same conversation was had with others who manage projects. And so that's been very important for me and for us and for, I think, the community to be able to have the buy-in that comes from the recognition of vulnerability without the participation in this cross-license community.
Fantastic, thank you, Keith. And it's a good point bringing up 13 years or so. I remember Jim typing busily in a corner one day when I think he was putting together the first major project deal for LF. It was one of the mobile operating systems coming into the LF ecosystem. It sure has snowballed since then, especially.
Yep, for sure.
Alrighty, with that, Keith, thank you very much indeed. Oh, we've got one more question. It's from Endo-san. He is. Oh, okay, they're answering each other in the questions. We have one more question from Endo-san, which is there any industry in particular you're focusing on, for instance, automotive or elsewhere?
I think, Endo-san, thank you for the question. What we're looking at is the automotive supply chain, the chip companies that support the industry, as well as the tier one suppliers, is to ensure that we are able to bring those companies into the community, as well as energy companies and banking and financial services, because we see real exposure from a patent standpoint particularly in banking and financial services. And so we have companies that are not as don't have the long track record of dealing with litigation in the way that many other industries do. We see what has essentially been a club of companies that agreed not to sue each other that are now facing attack from many different sectors because banking is changing, just as the auto space has changed over the last 5 years to go from a kind of a managed business with known parameters and a modest amount of litigation from patents to now with the electronics and changing not only the cabinet of the car, but changing the digital DNA of vehicles to embed much more software and more sophisticated software, and much of it open source software. We see that the recognition of how the world works is a bit different in terms of patenting, and that notion of collaboration that existed between auto companies to some degree and suppliers is now quite different. It's been disrupted, and I think that's what I'm also seeing is that it's part and parcel of a reemergence of auto companies as technology companies. I think Daimler and Toyota, usually the examples I use, are the two most sophisticated technology companies with the most significant history as technology leaders, and they are reasserting themselves, and it's changing the dynamic with tier ones as a result. And I think to a lesser extent, it's happening because the history is not there of being technology leaders in the banking and financial services world, but companies that provide comprehensive solutions to banks and financial services companies are having to recognize that more and more open source development is occurring inside banks and financial services companies, and they're building up and bulking up their technology chops to be able to be partners in innovation rather than simply bystanders that are at the mercy of large, big iron companies that provide solutions to them. And so I think this change is happening across multiple industries, and I think it's very healthy that companies are taking charge of their own technology futures.
Thank you, Keith. And Endo-san, Yan also posted that the OpenChain tooling workgroup is doing some work in this domain as well. And there are recordings online that he linked to, and I will put these in the chat. With that, Keith, thank you very much indeed. And we will begin our transition to Armine Hamel. So Armine, I'm going to give you the floor and you can present.
All right, so can you see this?
It's perfect.
So what about now?
Even more perfect.
All right, so final talk of this seminar. So thank you, Shane. Thank you, Keith. I'm going to talk about something a little bit more technical, namely about how we can reimagine clearing of files using a technique called proximity matching. So just a little bit about me. I'm an engineer. I'm not a lawyer. I used to work for GPLviolations.org, doing enforcement in Germany. I'm no longer doing that. But these days, I'm mostly focusing on things like compliance engineering and binary analysis. And in my daily life, I help companies with open source license compliance, like doing things like builds for license compliance or M&A, fighting trolls. I think with the troll that we finally fought off with McCarty, I think I did 40, 50 cases. I don't know exactly, a lot. And I do things like audits. So whenever companies have something that they want to put onto the market, I basically help them do a scan and then do an audit. So one of the things that I want to look into right now, so today, is about how we can reimagine the open source clearing process. So when talking to people, what I hear about how clearing processes work these days, I must admit I haven't done a lot of clearing myself, luckily, but usually it comes down to something like this. So there is a system in that they scan files. So first they filter all of the files that they already know that are previously scanned based on a cryptographic hash like SHA-256 or MD5. And then they clear the files using tools like code clone detectors or snippet matchers or things like license scanners, security tools, and so on. And then results are stored in a database along with metadata about that particular file or package, like a cryptographic hash, file name, package data, and so on. And I think that this is a waste of time to do this for every file that you get, because it doesn't take into account some key characteristics of open source. So if you're looking at open source, you will see that when you're looking at two different versions of packages, that very often the changes in those packages, they are incremental. You will sometimes see radical changes, but very often the changes are just very minimal, just a few lines here and there. And especially if you're looking at adjacent versions, like or minor upgrades, those are almost identical. And with the clearing processes right now, for every file that you haven't explicitly already seen, you're starting from scratch and you have to go through that whole clearing process again. And I think that's just a waste of time. So, is there a better way? I'm telling you that there is. And one of the things that I first want to look at is, can we find out how close a new file is to a known file in an efficient way, and then use this information? So for that, I'm going to talk about a technique called locality sensitive hashing. So most of the hashes that people are familiar with are hashes where a small change in the input leads to radically different results. So if you have a file and you make an MD5 checksum and then you change one byte, you get a radically different MD5 checksum. And with these hashes, avoiding clashes is extremely important. But there is also another category of hashes where clashes are intentional, so they can be compared. And the more clashes you have between the hashes, the closer two files are. So these are called locality sensitive hashes. And a popular one is TLS-H. And that was made by Trend Micro, and specifically for finding closely related malware. So malware tends to be changed just a few bytes or rearranged to avoid detections with hashes like MD5. And they needed a way to detect malware that is very, very similar. So comparing two TLS-H hashes gives you a distance. And a short distance between two hashes means that two files are very close to each other. So this works very well for certain kinds of files like BE, so that's Windows executable, and ELF executables, but it also works very well for source code. It doesn't work so well for other files, like files that are too short, that don't have enough entropy, like files with just one character, but then lots of them. It also doesn't work well for very large files, or things like compressed files, like archives, but also pictures like JPEG, GIF, and PNG. So Trend Micro actually has an implementation in C++, and there also are bindings for Python, and there are some implementations in other languages as well. So it has been adopted by companies like Malware Bazaar, VirusTotal, who made the Yara Swiss pattern matching tool, and also by me. I've been using it successfully for quite a long time. So what I did is just a small test. I had two files with GPL version 3, and in the GPL version 3 text, I replaced first GNU with OSADL. The reason is that I also gave this talk for OSADL yesterday, and I'm just copying that example. So there's first some setup code where I import the library, then I read the content, and then I compute the hashes for each of those. So what you can see is that those hashes are very similar except for the first few characters. So for the rest, they are completely identical. And if I then compare them, then basically TLS-H says me that there is a distance of 1, which means very, very close. So then I also did something else. I replaced all of the GNU with a space with, I changed that to OSADL with a space, and then I do something different. And then you can see that the hashes are already more different, but they're still quite similar, especially if you're doing this as a byte string, no, a bit string comparison, they will still be very, very similar. And then it says that the distance is 12, which is still quite close, but it's already a bit bigger. And with this, you can basically compare files through TLSH hashes to see how close they are. So TLSH is fairly quick, but not as quick as other hashes are, like MD5. So what if you need to compare millions of hashes or more? This is not hypothetical. I talked to a few companies, and I think that they said that in the last half year they compared 20 million hashes, or no, 20 million unique files that they just scanned. So the companies are scanning at a massive scale. So millions of hashes, that's not unrealistic at all. But instead of walking a list, like just doing everything sequentially, you definitely need a different data structure, like some sort of tree. And a solution that Trend Micro had was to use a thing called a vantage point tree with TLSH hashes. So what I did is they recently published, well, not recently, in 2020, I think 2020, I don't know exactly, but they actually presented a algorithm called HACT, which is used for efficient clustering based on TLSH, which you can find actually on GitHub, a reference implementation. And inside this code base is actually an implementation of this vantage point tree using TLSH. So what I did together with a few students from OS 3.nl, that is the system administrator studies at the University in Amsterdam, what I did is we made the code a lot more Pythonic instead of the original Python written by C++ programmers code. And we optimized the hell out of it and then turned it into a web service with Flask. And the result is that I now have a web service, which is that you can feed a TLSH hash, and then you will get, as a result, you will get a closest file from the web service. So the proximity matcher web service is based on Flask and Green Unicorn. It uses TLSH and vantage point trees, and it allows you to find a closest hash very quickly. I'm saying a closest hash because there could be multiple hashes that have the same result, but this web service will only return one result. So that's why I'm saying a closest hash and not the closest hash. So the example implementation that I made is quick. So searching for a closest license text in 5 million license text from software heritage with some optimizations. Then if you just give me a license text and I compute a TLSH hash and feed it into the web service, then a maximum of 0.6 seconds, usually a lot quicker. I did a test with a mass lookup, so 275,000 TLSH hashes using 8 threads, about 33 minutes, but the machine that I have is actually quite slow, so it could be a lot quicker. Memory usage, not too bad, 104 gigs per thread at the maximum, and then 1 gig for some extra cached data as well. And this all in 230 lines of Python code, including comments. So it's very small, it's very quick, it's also clean, very easy to read, and it will be open sourced soon. So proximity matching already solves one part of our problem, because now we can find a closest file. And if I have this information, then I can combine it with known information from the scans that we've done before for the other files. And now I can also compute a difference using Unix diff with the closest file that I found. Then I can show the difference with the closest file that I found by basically computing a diff and then displaying it. I can also grab the information associated with the closest file found. So for example, I already found that that a file that I had was from zlib, and then I can say, well, this is just one that is very close, so I can basically just copy the conclusion, like, hey, this is zlib. And but we can probably take this a little bit further by looking at where the changes happen in the file as well. So there's also a tool called SourceML, which parses a file and then annotates it with information about what kind of type each line or each token of a file is. So for example, is it an instruction? Is it a comment? Or maybe it's a function name or a method, and so on. And this allows me to find out if a certain part of a file is a comment or if it's actual code. So now I can combine this with information from the diff, and then I know, I know what change was made, but also what kind of code was changed. So is the change happening in a comment or is it happening in actual code? And then as the next step, what we can do is basically make decision rules, because we have every information that we need. We know what a closest file is in the collection of known files. We know where a change was made. We know what kind of information was changed. And then we can have things like rules with which you can decide, like a license rule. One rule could be rescan the file with the license scanner if a change was made in any of the comments. Or a security rule, like rescan the file with a security scanner if a change was made in the code. Another license rule would be if there's a change in the code, then just copy the old decision that we made about the license. Security rule could be if there's only changes in the comments, then don't rescan with a security scanner. And that allows us to do semi-automatic clearing of code, which should be a lot faster. So the implementation that I have right now, the proximity matching web service is working. It still needs some polish before I can release it. The other components that I mentioned, they already exist. SourceML is an existing tool. Diff is a very old Unix tool with lots of implementations like difflib in Python. But I still need to do some glue work. And quite a bit of the implementations probably also depends on internal company tools and processes and what kind of component catalog you use, or if you have something that was homegrown and so on. So I've not worked on that part specifically yet, but the proximity matching web service, that one is working and it's working well. So one thing that I want to say, because I already got this question from a few people, like, so, and basically they ask, so can we now ditch our snippet matcher? And I must say that this method is definitely not a replacement for a snippet matcher. It's something else. So this is not suited for finding small bits of code. So if you're looking for if one of your engineers copied something from Stack Overflow, this is not your tool. This is just to find out if a file you're scanning is close to a known file you already have. Also, you first need to create a baseline anyway. So this is not a replacement for other tools. It definitely can work in conjunction with the other tools, but it is not a replacement. What it can do is find different information. So it's not a snippet matcher. So if you want to want to read a little bit more, there is a defensive publication that I recently published, which you can find on tdcommons.org, and you can also contact me for a little bit more information at my email address. And then I'm ready to take questions.
Armine, thank you very much. I have one straight out the gate, which is, when you have a defensive publication on this, this suggests you're pioneering some new ground in this field. And with that optic, do you think the defensive publication is something that would be regarded as the start of a family of innovations around this? Or is it like, okay, we've described it fully here, we're done?
That's a good question. So first of all, I'm using tools that other people already published and also described in papers and published under Apache 2 as well. So core of the stuff that I'm using, of course, could not be patented at all. But these days, it's just my default modus operandi that whenever I make something that I think is interesting, I just first write a defensive publication. I already had other people patent my stuff. I don't want that to happen again.
That makes a lot of sense. A follow-up question is related to how broadly, do you think this approach could be adopted, not just from the tooling you're making, but other existing tools out there? Do you see your tooling fitting into a pre-existing framework? Do you see it operating independently? And are you open to collaborating with various parties to get this type of support implemented across the market?
Well, there's a reason I made it as a web service. So of course, yes, I want this to be adopted widely because I think it just makes sense. I'm not the only one who's thinking that. I talked with Philippe from NextB the other day, and I know that he's thinking along the same lines with Matchcode. So his
Yeah,
one of his new projects. So I think that more people are now ready for this kind of solution.
yeah, and I'm going to get Philip to talk about match code at our automation summit. I think we'll be having him do a good presentation about this technology. Now we've got a question from Martin. Have you tested this with forked software where the license changed, like Elasticsearch?
I have not actually tested with actual software, but what I did is I tested a lot with lots of license texts. But yeah, I guess that I could just run a test with actual source code like Elasticsearch. It would be interesting to see what happens. There's still quite a bit that needs to be researched, like what is um, a good size knowledge base. Should I separate things like C and C code and Java code or JavaScript, or do I all want that to be in one knowledge base? That's something that I still need to test. I mean, I literally made this just a few weeks ago.
And the reason that you're here talking about it, I think, is because it might be the first time we've seen this particular type of solution in play. But as you say, there's a lot more to do around it. When it comes to the practical testing of this, how would you like that to go? How would you like us to get this battle hardened?
That is a question that I currently do not know yet. So I will soon be making this code available. And after that, I just hope that people will start making implementations and just play with it a lot. As I said, I literally just got this off the ground a few weeks ago.
A related question of sorts. You've been working on another tool, a binary scanning tool, for a while. Uh,
Yeah.
how do these two things work together? Are you going to market with both as a kind of a solution? What's your game here? What's your plan?
Well, so the proximity matching could be used for anything that you can express as a TLSH hash. And of course, TLSH works great for ELF binaries. So yes, I will definitely be using that in Bang to see if a executable that I find in a firmware is very close to something that I've already seen before. Because as you know, a lot of the devices that are out there on the market are very often just identical or near identical because of the choices that the SoC vendors and ODMs made. So I think that I can do quite a bit of interesting stuff there with binaries as well with this method. But it's basically anything that you can express as a TLSH hash, you could put into this search structure and then do searches.
And I mean, I can see, and the reason you're here today is because this type of tool has very broad implications. I can see people utilizing it for all types of information analysis, including in areas like patents as well as copyright. So, it's something I think we should have on our radar. We can talk about copyright and patents a lot. We can implement solutions by processes a lot, but ultimately, automation is the key to efficiency. And there's companies out there like Proactive Patents, which do automation around patents. There are companies doing automation with software. But here we have something interesting with pattern matching that's just available. It's coming out of our community domain, and it's coming from one of the most reputable actors in the space. So that's something to very much have on our radar. Martin has a question following up. He's saying, I assume this tool will suffer when companies use code obfuscation. What do you think about that?
Well, yes. But the thing with code obfuscation is it's not a good strategy. If as soon as you have some open source code and you start, then I'm going to obfuscate that to evade detection, then you also lose a lot of the benefits of using that open source code, because for every version that you're using uh, later on, so if you want to upgrade, you also have to obfuscate that. So it's an added cost. It's a stupid strategy for a company to follow. But yeah, it's uh, probably this tool would suffer then, yes.
A question came in from Jan. This is a very interesting one as well. He's saying he's not quite sure about the current state, that he understands it. As of now, the TLSH implementation allows us to find closely related files that came across analysis before. Is he right? But as long as
He's
the
right.
next, okay. And he says, but as long as the next step is missing, I will have to look into those that have been discovered as somehow changed to understand what has changed. So he's saying that you need to do forward analysis to use the tool. This tool works
Well,
on
you
something already.
always need to establish a baseline, of course.
Mhm.
It's not something that I cannot it concludes things just from a certain hash of yes, you need to have a baseline first. So you need to go through those files in your knowledge base first,
Mhm.
and so that is a given. But as soon as you have that information, then you can say like, okay, what files do I already know that are close to a new file that I'm scanning, and then you can make lots of. Uh, then I think that you can save a lot of time or do
Yeah.
more targeted a targeted investigation into a certain file.
Is this suggesting that we're looking at a situation for a stacking of tools? Not this isn't innovative. We always stack tools, but we're looking at a situation where you want to stack your CI/CD and your resulting knowledge base, and then have a tool like this for further analysis of TLSH.
Yeah, I mean, it's this is mostly that you don't have to go through yet another copy of zlib or libpng and all that. So I know that people I talk to, they say that they have looked at something like hundreds of copies of zlib and all kinds of things, and they're all slightly different. Then they scan it and it's like, oh, it's zlib again.
Mhm.
With a tool like this, you can already do a lot of you can basically filter out a lot of that stuff already and be much more focused.
Makes sense. And Jan, if that doesn't fully answer your question, you can send a follow-up, of course. Now, I'm not sure how many people on the call are usually working at a much higher level than this, but I can I can assure you that what's interesting is that if we can have good optics into the strategy and the implementation of solutions around process management and automation, we're obviously going to do a better job. Now, Armine's talk is touching on the bigger topic of automation. It's touching on one of the exciting new developments, but the bigger topic. And we will have an automation summit in May where you're going to get a huge amount of information about a lot of tools, all of them open source tools for open source compliance. And that's where you can say, oh, I heard this talk. There's some interesting stuff here, but I'm a little confused about how things fit together. And you can go and see a lot of the tools, a lot of the solutions, and a lot of the interlinks. All right, Armine, thank you very much for an excellent talk. Deeply appreciated. And I'm looking forward to having you at the Automation Summit as well.
My pleasure.
Everyone, thank you for your time. This event is being recorded and will be shared with our global community. It's been great to have you here with your questions. It's been great to have you as an audience. But we do also hope that the recording will be shared with your colleagues, your peers, and your competitors to help set the tone for copyright and patents this year. Big thank you to Keith Burgell, CEO of OIN, who made time for us very specially to give a comprehensive overview of his optics of the patent situation. And of course, to Armine, who has been working very hard on cool stuff and took time out to show us what it was. Be well, Be safe, and I trust I will talk with you very soon.